Hi, I'm Kийt Макхенри, and I'm excited to join you at the Soupstock 2020 in Sofia, Bulgaria. I'm one of the 8 original people that helped start Food Not Bombs on May 24th, 1980. And at that time, I was an art student at Boston University, and I had an American history professor named Howard Zinn that would talk about the protests he was attending at Seabrook Nuclear Power Station in Seabrook, New Hampshire, about 40 miles north of Boston. And I joined Clamshell Alliance and the Coalition for Direct Action at Seabrook and participated in a number of large protests, including on May 24th, 1980, where one of my friends, Brian Feigenbaum, was arrested for felony assault of a police officer. And we were desperate to get him out of jail, and we were able to find a person with some money who bailed him out that afternoon. And then on the way home, Brian and his friends, which included me, started having a discussion about how to raise money to pay this man back. And our idea was to do a bake sale and raise money that way. In the United States, it's common for schools to have the parents raise money for their school supplies by doing bake sales from parent-teacher association organizations to the community that their school is in. And so we started doing these bake sales, and we didn't really make any money. And at the same time, I had an old van and a moving company called Smooth Move. So I was moving this family, activist family, and they had a poster that said, wouldn't it be a beautiful day if the schools had all the money they needed and the Air Force had to hold a bake sale to buy a bomber. And we decided that's such a funny poster with such a, it had such a strong message that what we could do is go to the Army Navy surplus store, buy some military uniforms, and take our baked goods out with this sign and tell people that we're trying to buy a bomber. And while we didn't really make much more money, we made a lot more impact, and people would stop and talk to us and find out why we were doing this bake sale. And we found that it was a very good way to reach people that otherwise would never talk to you about nuclear power or the arms race or vegan food for that matter. And so then I was also a produce worker all through this time, and I was throwing away a lot of great organic produce from the store that I worked at, Bread and Circus in Cambridge. And I started taking that food down to the housing projects about 3 blocks away from the store. And one day I'm talking to the people that are getting the food, and they're telling me about how they're designing nuclear weapons at the new building across the street. And I thought, wow, you're desperate for food here, but they got a brand new building to design nuclear weapons. And that was where I got the idea of Food Not Bombs as a name. And then after that, we were trying to organize in Boston against the nuclear power station and draw connections between the Ronald Reagan coming to power, which he did in January of 1981, and the nuclear industry, as well as nuclear bombs and what was going on with Seabrook. And so we decided we'd do street theater outside the stockholders meeting of the Bank of Boston, where the board of directors basically ran the nuclear industry in New England. And so our idea was to dress up like hobos and have a soup line and say that the policies of Reagan and the policies of the Bank of Boston and the policies of these board of directors of the Bank of Boston would lead to a future where people would have to stand in line to get food at a soup kitchen. And so we made a lot of food, and we started becoming concerned that evening, the evening before this protest, that there wouldn't really be a lot of people and it wouldn't look like a soup line. So I went to the Pine Street Inn, which was a shelter that had continued from the Great Depression on until into the 80s, and it actually still exists to this day, and gave a speech to the guys sitting around on the floor and sleeping on benches. And I was like, well, this is why we got to protest against the Bank of Boston, and then why we got to protest against Ronald Reagan. And they're like, this is great, a protest like the 60s, it's all coming back. And so the next day, about 50 guys from the Pine Street Inn showed up. And there were pedestrians that were like, wow, I can't believe that that Reagan's only been in power like about a month, and there's already so much hunger in America that there's now soup lines. And so we gave them information about, well, it's not yet happening, but it will if we don't all unite and push back. Well, as we were packing up, the people that came to eat with us said, oh, you should do this every day. There's no food for people that live on the streets. And so that evening, we decided we would quit our jobs and we would do nothing but collect food from grocery stores and bakeries and the farmers market, and that we would take it to housing projects, to battered women's shelters, and to other places that desperately needed food. And then in the afternoons and evenings, we would do street theater in Harvard Square or in the Boston Commons, providing free meals to anyone that came. And so that was the founding of Food Not Bombs. And then in 1988, I ended up moving to San Francisco, where Food Not Bombs was arrested on August 15th of that year. And those arrests, 94 arrests in the 4 weeks leading up to what we call Labor Day in the United States, the first Monday of September, received huge global news. And people started to write letters and to leave phone messages for us on how they wanted to start a chapter themselves, because they were outraged that the riot police would come in and arrest us for feeding the hungry. And so I took my notes from helping start the second chapter and made it into a flyer called 7 Steps to Starting a Food Not Bombs. And that started a whole number of chapters growing, first in New York City and Prague, Czechoslovakia, in Victoria, British Columbia, and Melbourne, Australia, Toronto. And then before long, there was another wave of arrests the next year, and then more and more groups started as a result of that, until finally we're in over 1,000 cities and 65 countries. And currently, hundreds of those chapters are on the front lines of the corona virus pandemic, and are having all kinds of struggles and thinking in all kinds of new ways about how to make sure that the people that are abandoned on the streets and are abandoned to poverty are able to get food. But also, this is an amazing time in the 40-year history of Food Not Bombs, because the way that capitalism is collapsing and morphing gives us an opportunity to really develop conversation between all the Food Not Bombs chapters and amongst ourselves at our meals, to figure out ways to actually have a kind of a post-oppressive, post-money-based way of organizing our communities. And I think that this is a huge opening right now. So I'm hoping that the Soupstock 2020 is a beginning of a new dialogue and a new era where we really step up and show that what is important is community, cooperation, solidarity, that what people really need is healthy food, drinking water, health care, and compassion, and that we can really transform our world to be the future that is sustainable and is not just going to be crushed in a tsunami of climate change crisis and fascism, and that we will actually be able to rise above that and do what is really just logical, which is celebrate life and do what works for the majority of people. So again, happy birthday, and fantastic that you're celebrating Soupstock 2020, and I can't wait to return to Sofia and meet all of you. And Bulgaria is definitely one of my favorite places I've ever spent time at, and so I look forward to my return. Happy birthday.